The House of Representatives under Republican control has once again pushed through a significant piece of legislation. On May 22, 2025, a bill grandly titled Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill narrowly passed. The vote was extremely close, a mere 215 to 214 with one abstention, highlighting the deep divisions even within the Republican Party, or perhaps the razor-thin majority they command. This bill is not a simple piece of housekeeping. It's a sweeping agenda that aims to reshape American fiscal policy and immigration enforcement. It represents a clear statement of intent from the former president and his allies in Congress, signaling a return to priorities from his first term. The bill is a complex package. It bundles together several major policy objectives. These include extending tax cuts, introducing new tax breaks, increasing government spending in certain areas, and funding controversial immigration measures. Supporters hail it as a pro-growth, pro-America agenda. They argue it will stimulate the economy and secure the nation. However, critics, and there are many, point to the enormous potential costs. They see a repeat of past mistakes where promises of economic miracles obscure the reality of rising deficits and debt. The name itself, One Big Beautiful Bill, seems designed more for a rally than for serious policy debate. The timing of this legislation is also significant. It comes as the nation grapples with various economic uncertainties. Inflation, while perhaps moderated from previous peaks, remains a concern for many households. Interest rates are higher than they have been in years, impacting borrowing costs for everything from mortgages to business investment. In this environment, a bill that proposes massive unfunded tax cuts and spending increases raises immediate red flags for fiscal responsibility. It suggests a willingness to ignore long-term consequences for short-term political gains, a pattern we have seen before with alarming frequency. The passage through the House is, of course, only the first step in a long and arduous legislative journey. The Senate presents a different and likely more challenging landscape, but the House vote sets the stage for a major political battle. It forces a national conversation about the direction of the country's economic and social policies. The implications of this bill, should it become law, would be far-reaching. They would affect everything from individual tax burdens to the nation's ability to fund essential services and maintain its standing in the global economy. The stakes are undeniably high. A central pillar of Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill is the proposal to extend the tax cuts enacted during Donald Trump's first term. These tax cuts, primarily benefiting corporations and high-income earners, were originally set to expire. Their extension has long been a key objective for Republican policymakers. They argue that making these cuts permanent will provide certainty for businesses and encourage investment, thereby stimulating economic growth. This argument, however, has been a subject of intense debate since the cuts were first introduced, with little evidence to support the grand claims made at the time. The original 2017 tax cuts significantly reduced the corporate tax rate and provided various deductions and benefits skewed towards the wealthy. Proponents claimed these changes would pay for themselves through increased economic activity. This did not happen. Instead, the national debt ballooned, even before the economic disruptions of the pandemic. Extending these cuts means foregoing trillions of dollars in potential government revenue over the next decade. This revenue is desperately needed to fund existing government programs, let alone any new initiatives proposed in this very same bill. It's a classic case of wanting to have your cake and eat it too. The economic impact of these extensions is highly questionable. Most mainstream economists agree that the 2017 cuts provided a modest, short-lived boost to the economy, at best. The primary beneficiaries were shareholders and corporate executives, not average workers. Wages for most Americans did not see a significant uptick directly attributable to these cuts. Instead, corporations often used the windfall for stock buybacks and dividend payments. Repeating this experiment, especially in the current economic climate, seems like a recipe for exacerbating inequality and further indebting the nation without delivering widespread prosperity. The argument for certainty also needs careful scrutiny. While businesses do appreciate predictability, the kind of certainty offered by massive, unfunded tax cuts is a double-edged sword. It creates certainty about lower tax bills for some, but also certainty about rising government debt. This rising debt can lead to higher interest rates in the long run, crowding out private investment and potentially leading to calls for austerity measures that would harm ordinary citizens. The focus remains narrowly on the benefits for a select few, ignoring the broader economic landscape and the fiscal health of the country. Beyond extending previous tax cuts, Trump's one big beautiful bill includes some new headline-grabbing tax promises. Among the most publicized are proposals to make tips and overtime wages entirely tax-free. These ideas are clearly designed to appeal to specific segments of the workforce, particularly service industry employees and those who rely on overtime pay. On the surface, the promise of keeping more of one's hard-earned money is undeniably attractive. Who wouldn't want to pay less tax on the extra hours they work or the tips they receive for good service? However, the fiscal implications of these proposals are significant and likely underestimated by proponents. While marketed as a boon for workers, exempting these forms of income from taxation would create new loopholes and complexities in the tax code. It would also lead to a substantial loss of revenue. This lost revenue would either need to be made up elsewhere, perhaps through cuts to public services or increases in other taxes, or it would simply add to the burgeoning national debt. The promise of no taxes on tips and overtime sounds simple, but the economic reality is far more complicated. Furthermore, the actual benefit to workers might be less than advertised. For tipped employees, the primary issue is often not the tax on tips, but the sub-minimum wage many receive relying on tips to reach the standard minimum wage. Making tips tax-free doesn't address this fundamental problem of low base pay. For overtime, while a tax exemption sounds good, it could inadvertently incentivize employers to rely more on overtime rather than hiring additional staff, potentially leading to worker burnout. The focus seems to be on a catchy slogan rather than a comprehensive solution to workers' economic challenges. These targeted tax breaks also raise questions of fairness and equity. Why should tips and overtime be tax-free when other forms of hard-earned income remain fully taxable? Such exemptions can distort economic behavior and create resentment among different groups of workers. While the political appeal is understandable, offering a direct, tangible benefit to certain voters, the policy itself appears to be more about clever marketing than sound economic management. It's another example of a short-term giveaway that could have long-term negative consequences for the nation's fiscal health and the fairness of the tax system. Paradoxically, alongside massive tax cuts, Trump's one big beautiful bill also incorporates hundreds of billions of dollars in new spending. This combination of reduced revenue and increased expenditure is a recipe for fiscal disaster, yet it is a path that some policymakers seem determined to tread. The specific areas targeted for this new spending are varied, but they contribute to an overall picture of a government expanding its financial commitments without a clear plan for how to pay for them. This approach defies basic fiscal logic and common sense. The details of this new spending are still emerging, but reports indicate significant allocations towards various projects and initiatives favored by the bill's proponents. This could include infrastructure projects, though perhaps not the kind focused on green energy or public transit, and funding for specific industries or regions. While some government spending is essential and can be beneficial, the concern here is the scale of the new commitments, especially when coupled with a reluctance to raise the necessary revenue. It represents a dramatic expansion of government outlay at a time when fiscal prudence is sorely needed. This surge in spending, if enacted, would further strain the federal budget. It would place additional pressure on existing programs and services, potentially leading to cuts in areas deemed less politically expedient. The notion that a country can simultaneously cut taxes for the wealthy, introduce new tax breaks, and embark on a major spending spree without dire consequences is a dangerous fantasy. The arithmetic simply does not add up. Someone eventually will have to pay the bill, and it is likely to be future generations burdened with a crippling national debt. The political motivations behind this spending are also worth considering. Often, large spending packages are used to garner support for a bill by directing funds to specific districts or interest groups. This can make legislation more palatable to individual lawmakers, but does not necessarily serve the broader national interest. The hundreds of billions figure is alarming, and without transparent justification and sustainable funding mechanisms, it risks being perceived as reckless pork barrel spending rather than a strategic investment in the country's future. The lack of fiscal discipline is a recurring theme. Section 5. Fortifying the forces, a surge in military expenditure. A significant portion of the new spending outlined in Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill is earmarked for a substantial military buildup. This aligns with a long-standing priority of the former president and many in his party, who advocate for a stronger, more dominant military presence on the global stage. The bill proposes to channel vast sums into the defense budget, likely for new weapon systems, increased troop numbers, and expanded military operations. The argument, as always, is that such investment is crucial for national security and projecting American strength. While maintaining a strong defense is undoubtedly important, the scale of the proposed increase warrants careful examination. The United States already spends more on its military than the next several countries combined. Critics will rightly ask whether these additional billions are being allocated effectively, or if they are simply feeding the insatiable appetite of the military-industrial complex. There is a persistent danger that massive defense budgets can lead to wasteful spending, cost overruns on unproven technologies, and an over-reliance on military solutions to complex geopolitical problems that might be better addressed through diplomacy or economic engagement. The financial implications of this military buildup are considerable. It contributes directly to the hundreds of billions in new spending, further exacerbating the deficit and adding to the national debt. In a world of finite resources, every dollar spent on a new missile system is a dollar that cannot be spent on education, healthcare, infrastructure, or renewable energy research. The debate is not just about whether a strong military is necessary, but about the opportunity cost of investing so heavily in defense at the expense of other critical national priorities. Moreover, a rapid military expansion can also have unintended geopolitical consequences. It can be perceived as provocative by other nations, potentially fueling arms races and increasing international tensions. While proponents argue it acts as a deterrent, it can also lead to miscalculations and an escalation of conflicts. A truly secure nation requires not only military strength, but also economic stability, social cohesion, and robust diplomatic relationships. Over-prioritizing one aspect, particularly through massive unfunded spending, can undermine the others, leading to a less secure nation overall. Section 6. The Immigration Hardline, Deportation Drives and Funding. Beyond fiscal matters, Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill also strongly supports the White House's objectives to deport immigrants. This is a key component of the former president's agenda, and the bill allocates substantial resources towards achieving these goals. This funding is likely intended for increased border enforcement, the hiring of more immigration agents, the expansion of detention facilities, and the facilitation of large-scale deportation operations. This aspect of the bill is perhaps one of the most controversial, touching on deeply divisive issues of national identity, human rights, and economic impact. The push for aggressive deportation measures is framed by supporters as a necessary step to uphold the rule of law, secure the borders, and protect American jobs. They argue that undocumented immigrants place a strain on public services and that a tougher stance is needed to deter illegal immigration. However, opponents highlight the immense human cost of such policies, including the separation of families and the creation of a climate of fear within immigrant communities. They also point to the economic contributions of immigrants, both documented and undocumented, and argue that mass deportations could harm key sectors of the economy. The practicalities and costs of such large-scale deportation efforts are also a significant concern. Identifying, detaining, and deporting millions of people is an enormous logistical and financial undertaking. It requires a vast bureaucracy and significant public expenditure, funds that are being allocated within a bill that is already fiscally strained by tax cuts and other spending increases. There are also questions about due process and the potential for a humanitarian crisis if these policies are implemented without adequate safeguards and consideration for individual circumstances. This focus on deportation is not just a matter of policy, it is a reflection of a particular political ideology. It often plays to nativist sentiments and can exacerbate social divisions. While every nation has the right to control its borders, the manner in which immigration policies are enforced speaks volumes about its values. Tying these aggressive deportation objectives so closely to a major tax and spending bill signals that this is a top-tier priority, one for which the administration is willing to expend considerable political and financial capital, regardless of the broader social and economic consequences. Section 7. The looming mountain national debt under further strain. The inevitable consequence of simultaneously cutting taxes and increasing spending, as proposed in Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill, is a dramatic increase in the national debt. The legislation is expected to add trillions of dollars to the already colossal sum the United States owes. This isn't a controversial projection, it's basic arithmetic. When revenue goes down and expenditures go up, the deficit widens, and the accumulated deficits form the national debt. This is a path of fiscal recklessness that has been warned against by economists across the political spectrum for years. The sheer scale of the projected debt increase is staggering. We are not talking about small adjustments but about figures that will significantly alter the nation's long-term fiscal trajectory. A rising national debt has numerous negative consequences. It can lead to higher interest rates as the government competes with private borrowers for capital, making it more expensive for businesses to invest and for individuals to buy homes or finance education. It also means a growing portion of the federal budget must be dedicated to servicing that debt-paying interest, leaving less money available for essential public services. Proponents of such policies often dismiss concerns about the debt, arguing that economic growth spurred by tax cuts will eventually solve the problem, or that the debt doesn't matter as much as some people claim. These arguments have been repeatedly debunked by historical evidence. The growth promised by previous large tax cuts has rarely materialized to the extent claimed, and certainly not enough to offset the revenue loss. Ignoring the debt is not a sustainable strategy, it is merely postponing the day of reckoning and making the eventual adjustments more painful. Ultimately, a continuously growing national debt poses a threat to economic stability and national sovereignty. It can limit the government's ability to respond to future crises, whether economic downturns or national emergencies. It can also make the country more reliant on foreign creditors. The casual disregard for this looming mountain of debt demonstrated by Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill is deeply irresponsible. It prioritizes short-term political objectives over the long-term economic health and security of the nation, burdening future generations with the consequences of today's profligacy. Section 8, Senate Showdown, the bill's uncertain path forward. Despite its narrow passage in the House of Representatives, Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill faces a much more uncertain future in the Senate. The dynamics in the upper chamber are different, and even if Republicans hold a majority there, it is likely to be a slim one. This means that just a few dissenting voices within the party could derail the legislation or force significant modifications. The bill's controversial elements, particularly its massive impact on the national debt and its hardline immigration provisions, are likely to encounter stronger resistance in the more deliberative Senate. Senators often view themselves as taking a longer-term perspective compared to their House colleagues, who face re-election every 2 years. Concerns about fiscal responsibility and the potential economic fallout from adding trillions to the debt may weigh more heavily on some senators. Furthermore, specific provisions, such as the tax cuts predominantly benefiting the wealthy or the aggressive deportation measures, could prove unpalatable to moderate Republicans or those representing states with more diverse populations and economic interests. The art of legislating in the Senate often requires more compromise and bipartisan appeal, neither of which seems to be a hallmark of this particular bill. The legislative process in the Senate allows for procedural tactics like the filibuster that can be used by the minority party to block or delay legislation, although budget-related bills can sometimes bypass this through reconciliation. However, even with reconciliation, achieving consensus within the majority party itself will be a significant hurdle. Debates are likely to be intense, and various amendments will almost certainly be proposed. The bill that eventually emerges from the Senate, if one emerges at all, could look quite different from the version passed by the House. Therefore, while the House passage marks a victory for the bill's proponents, it is far from the final word. The true test will come in the Senate, where the complex interplay of political pressures, ideological differences, and procedural rules will determine its fate. The nation will be watching closely as senators grapple with the profound implications of this legislation for America's economic future, its social fabric, and its standing in the world. The outcome is anything but certain, and the debate is likely to be protracted and contentious, reflecting the deep divisions the bill itself embodies. Section 9, A Familiar Gamble, Economic Realities versus Political Promises. In essence, Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill represents a familiar gamble, one that pits appealing political promises against stark economic realities. The allure of tax cuts for everyone, from corporations to tipped workers, combined with increased spending on popular items like the military, is a potent political cocktail. It offers something for various constituencies, at least on the surface. However, this approach consistently ignores the fundamental principle that there is no such thing as a free lunch. The costs, deferred though they may be, are enormous and will inevitably have to be confronted. This legislative package embodies a particular brand of fiscal policy, one that prioritizes immediate gratification through tax reductions and targeted spending, while largely disregarding the long-term consequences for national debt and fiscal stability. The argument that these measures will unleash unprecedented economic growth that pays for everything is a recurring theme, yet one that history has treated unkindly. More often than not, such policies lead to widening inequality, as the benefits of tax cuts accrue disproportionately to the wealthy, and a heavier debt burden for future generations to manage. The inclusion of aggressive deportation measures and a military buildup further complicates the picture, adding social and geopolitical dimensions to the economic gamble. These are policies with profound human and international consequences, funded within a bill that is already straining fiscal limits. It raises questions about national priorities. Is the focus on building a sustainable and equitable economy, or on pursuing ideological goals, regardless of the cost? The bill seems to lean heavily towards the latter, risking economic stability for political wins. Ultimately, the passage of such a bill through the House signals a willingness to double down on a high-stakes economic experiment. Whether this gamble will pay off or lead to deeper economic challenges remains to be seen, particularly as it faces the Senate. However, the lessons of the past suggest caution. The promise of a big, beautiful outcome often masks a far more complex and potentially perilous reality. Responsible governance requires acknowledging these realities, not dismissing them in favor of politically expedient narratives. The long-term health of the American economy depends on it.